Apparently we had some technical difficulties with the sound, but the images say it all. Karen Ann Armstrong, the daughter of Neil and Janet Armstrong, died at the age of 2.5 after an intense struggle with a cancerous brain tumor on her brain stem. She passed away, in fact, on Neil and Janet's wedding anniversary. And their sons tell us that they never celebrated their wedding anniversary ever again. Fair to say, it was the deepest and most profound hurt of their lives, which they carried with them all through their lives. And they dealt with it, as each of us have dealt with our own things, in their own unique ways. Neil Armstrong was an intensely private man. And this was a subject that no one even dared to raise in public interviews. As to the scene in the movie First Man, his two sons say that their father definitely did something to remember Karen. But the exact nature of what happened on the moon, Neil didn't share that with anyone. Not with his wife, not with his sons. What we do know is that he did carry personal items to the moon. What we do know is, and this was so unlike him, that during his walk on the moon, he disappeared from the view of the camera and his audio went silent, which, as I said before, was not the way he usually operated. As I said just 2 weeks ago, we're reminded that no amount of fame or celebrity or wealth or achievement can shield us, any of us, from life's harder edges. No one is immune. No one in the world, no one gets a pass. Vulnerability is woven into the fabric of life. And that reality makes me, as much as you, makes me as uneasy as it makes you. And we're reminded again that all of us who grieve, all of us who have lost people that we love, we build our own memorials in our own way. It could be a bracelet left in the shadow of a crater. It could be a lone flower from the funeral 3 years ago that stubbornly pushes through the snow. In case I remember of my own father with his father, an old ragged coat and a hat worn, hanging off to the side of a closet. I dare say that there are many ways to build a memorial, as there are broken hearts. It's All Saints Sunday, and to this church people come with their joys, and I am very much aware of the fact that some of you come with your sorrows as well. Some hearts have been recently bruised. And in this time of remembrance that takes place within the wider context of all the saints, those who are to our left and our right, in front of us and behind us, and those, again, as we are reminded, who have been called to God's nearer presence. The festival of All Saints, this day, someone wrote, directs our attention to the richness of Christ's Christian history and the experience of the grace of God. We're reminded that in our own baptism, we entered into a story that had been going on a long time before you ever showed up. The story of people following Jesus in their own time and in their own way. Stories that offer lessons and encouragement and sometimes even warnings as we follow Jesus in our own time and in our own place. Invariably, if you look at all the literature and all the sermons and the homilies and the reflections written on All Saints, at some point somebody endeavors to say what a saint is. And I was reading the other day, just a few days ago, that periodically the Catholic Church visits its list of 6,000 plus saints. They add some, they take some out. In essence, they prune the list. I was happy to learn that they finally have come to their senses, and they have removed St. Christopher, but they have added St. George. I think that's a good move. And that list is important. In God's flirtation with the world, someone said God drops handkerchiefs, and those handkerchiefs are saints. These are the people through whom the Son has shown luminous examples to us all that following Jesus is never easy, but ultimately it's the only life worth living. Of course, everyone in this room knows, you all know, that by God's reckoning, the list is much, much, much larger than just 6,000 names. For myself, here at St. Mark, the years that I've been here, in all the other places I've been, I can think of a lot of people who wouldn't make anybody's list, but who have shown me what discipleship looks like, who tempt me to believe again and again that Jesus really is the way, the truth, and the life. So a saint is, and sometimes it's best maybe to define a saint by what it is not. A saint is not perfect. The names that we read, you profess undying love, but no one in their wildest, fevered imagination would say that any of the people that we name today were perfect. Not one. Saints are particularly pious. They're not particularly holy, as the world thinks of piety and holy. The saints that I've known, none of them were otherworldly. Just kind of standing there, staring off into space, hearing voices and angelic choirs. And the saints that I know, the saints that I have known, were not necessarily famous. And there are saints who have lived in the world who were never acknowledged in their time. And maybe they were only acknowledged only by God. Someone who became transfigured in a certain moment, who in Christ's name brought light to a moment of darkness, who brought hope to people when all they knew was despair. David Lowes says, saints are vulnerable. These are people who clearly recognize that life has harder edges, who know that Jesus doesn't bring to you, to any of you, to me, a magical exemption from life. But rather than denial or despair, which I understand, and I do not stand in judgment of anyone, I know how easy it is to slip into those things. But that vulnerability drives you closer to Christ, who came down the mountain this morning into the midst of the people, who, as Paul says, did not count equality with God as something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, who John says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Always acknowledging that Jesus doesn't just stand there and shout encouragement from the sidelines, but became vulnerable himself. You know that. And who alone in all the world can say, in the world you have trouble. You will have trouble, all of you. But be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. That and that alone makes it possible to acknowledge our frailty. And in certain moments, and I know some people this doesn't sit well, but if you haven't found yourself there yet, unfortunately, I can promise you that someday you will. Your absolute, utter helplessness in the face of circumstances. To know that in that moment, Jesus gets it. That little Karen Armstrong, and this I have no doubt, and her mother, and her famous father, and the loved ones that we name today are caught up in the promise of God, the God who raises the dead. Amen.